All right, John, let's talk about Darth Asmodée again, like we did last episode. They're the whipping boy of the moment. Let's whip on them some more. What's your take on the whole price controls that they've been slowly bringing to bear on the marketplace?
I mean, the whole thing's kind of been a bit of a wiggly worm, right? I mean, it's been really hard to even figure out exactly how it's going to change things, specifically just to us as consumers, right? But even necessarily what it is that they're actually sort of imposing on the retailers, because that's at least the core of it for me, is that, you know, we all sort of have our retailers or vendors that we typically go to, and we champion their cause, usually because they are giving us a better price than everyone else, or we like their service or whatever. And that's been the battle cry from day one, is everyone's going, wait a minute, this is unfair to the people that I normally support, and you're forcing me to go support someone I don't want to support. That is, to me at least, the more interesting part. It's not necessarily the price fixing, quote unquote, part of it, but it's more the engineering of which retail outlets I, as a gamer, am sort of encouraged to attend based on, you know, certain relationships in between distribution and retail, which I guess really isn't. I mean, there's nothing new there. That probably happens all the time. I guess it's just kind of weird to be privy to the information, maybe. I don't know. Maybe that's the disconnect.
Well, I think it happens in all industries. That's the big takeaway from this, is that because board games have been how, for whatever reason, you know, the marketplace for board games, and I have ideas of why it is, but coming up across the last, again, 10 years or so of what we've gotten used to in the marketplace, I think this kind of price controls, I guess, more than fixing, it probably happens in almost everything you buy, right?
Yeah.
It isn't like you go to Walmart and Doritos are $1, and then you go to the grocery store and Doritos are $5, right? They're within, 50 cents of each other. So this stuff is probably happening in retail overall. It's just the way it is. I think board games, we've gotten into that. Historically, I think the board games they're expensive to produce and they're super expensive to store.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably something for another podcast, but we've talked about how these little companies, they go on Kickstarter, they sell $400,000 worth of games, they print all these games, and then they vanish because they went bankrupt. And it's like, you sold 400,000 games. How are you possibly bankrupt? And the reason is because they have to store those games until they sell through them. And most little companies are not prepared. They do not have the capital to be able to warehouse that stuff and to be able to store that stuff for the 5 years it takes to sell through the inventory. And I think what happened is, because board games were historically, at least, the independent board games, not Hasbro, but the Fantasy Flights, the Z-Man games, all of the old game companies before they were Asmodee game companies, those guys, I think at its most basic level, unless I just don't understand that how distribution works. The company that produces that product, they sell it to the distributor and they're done with it. Distributor is the one who is going to, they're the middleman.
Yeah.
At its most basic level, it doesn't matter when a game publisher, it doesn't matter what happens to it after they sell it to the distributor. Right? They sell this game for $15 to the distributor, and then the distributor sells it to the store for $30, and then the store sells it to you for $50. Whatever happens after that initial game is sold for $15 is irrelevant to the publisher. They sold the game for $15. I think what happened, and this is conjecture, but I feel like it's logically probably correct, is that historically, because we're so niche and because it is cost prohibitive to sell, to make small print runs of games, I think the board game industry kind of grew up around, we have to print 10,000 of these and we can't store them. So we'll print 10,000 of them. We'll sell them to the distributor for $10 a piece or $15 a piece or whatever it is. And then after that, we don't care what happens because we need to move 10,000 of these. Mm-hmm. And then at the distribution level, they would take whatever minimal markup they could possibly get to still make a profit on it, to make their distribution center profitable. they would give it to the online game stores, and that would be the normal kind of course of things. But we had the rise of internet commerce, right, where all of these stores discovered that you could have an online store for a specialty item that didn't necessarily need to be displayed. It isn't like you go into typically a board game store and kick the tires, right? So when people want a copy of Twilight Imperium, they just want a copy of Twilight Imperium. It's not an impulse buy. So these stores figured out, well, if we only have 4 employees, because we don't actually have to have face-to-face, we just need somebody to grab the games, put them in a box, and ship them out. We have no overhead. Then we can sell these games for like 40% off retail.
Yeah.
And I think what happened, that was kind of organically what happened. And then for the longest time, that became the status quo, because now a company could, they could make this game and they would have to print 10,000 of them to make it feasible to print. And these online game stores would buy 75% of that stock, and the publisher didn't care because they were shipping it, right?
Yeah.
It was out of their hair. And a couple factors now. One is the user base exploding, right? The board game boom, the Wheaton effect, whatever you want to call it. The industry is absolutely exploding. With that, it becomes a very lucrative market. And when a market becomes very lucrative, people that aren't really involved in the industry notice it, and they want a piece of it.
Yeah.
And that's what's gotten us to Darth Asmodée. Asmodée it's not Zev running Z-Man, who does it because he loves board games and he figured out a way to make money doing the things he loves.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. It's 8 guys in a boardroom
looking at market shares, right, and looking at profit margins.
Yeah. And that's all that it means. And they don't really understand the gaming industry other than it makes a lot of money right now. It's a growing market, and there's cash to be made.
Well, I would say that they probably understand the gaming industry as an industry and a business very well, but maybe they don't necessarily understand it from the consumer side.
Right, and they don't understand, or understand maybe a poor choice of words. They don't appreciate nor feel the desire for passion projects, for niche stuff, for as we talked about with Fantasy Flight before they were eaten by Asmodée, with the Talisman expansions, just pushing those out, knowing we're not going to sell very many of these, but people have been buying this for years, and it's just like a little bone for them.
Mm-hmm.
Companies like Asmodée don't throw bones. They will cancel a game the day after it releases if it didn't meet X amount of sales in X amount of time.
Yeah.
They're vicious because they're just going down the spreadsheet going profitable, profitable, not profitable, 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 not profitable. That's just the nature of it.
I agree with exactly how it sort of looks from where we stand. Just, reading this little press release that came out, a while back and kind of seeing how it's affected. The thing that I immediately seized on, though, is that looking through it, like not just kind of at what it's going to affect in terms of us as a consumer. The thing that I see specifically is there's 3 or 4 things that are going on in this change, right? It's not just the banning of online sales. There's also a really important thing that's going on where they are both limiting sub-distribution, right, where you can't now buy and sell their products at that sort of price point, that distribution price point, without being one of their distributors, right? I mean, they've now sort of clamped down on that. And then in addition to that, they are really paring down their distribution channel. I think they have like 5 now that they use instead of the big, however many there are, but there's a lot more than 5. And they've picked these particular 5 to sort of cover the country and, have all the avenues of sale taken care of in terms of region. But I'm pretty sure the way they picked those 5 is just the 5 that were willing to play by their rules. That's really what it comes down to. I would be very interested to see what other companies those distribution lines carry and everything, to see if they needed the cash cow that is Asmodee North America, or if they were perfectly fine on their own and they could have turned away and they just chose not to for whatever reason. I mean, that would actually be pretty telling. However, again, if you look at this sort of, okay, let's clamp down on online sales, let's clamp down on shelf distribution, and let's also limit our distributors, what they've essentially done is they have wiped their products out of the the stores of those particular online retailers that weren't really retailers. They were kind of floating in this gray space in between being a retailer and also being a distributor, which is probably how the prices were so stinking cheap for them, is because they, were able to sort of float in that middle ground, which I get why they kind of may want to make some people play by those particular retail rules. The thing that I don't understand yet, and I would love to have someone sort of lay out in very simple lemonade stand terms for me, because that's kind of my understanding of the way this stuff works, is everyone is saying that this is FFG and Asmodée's big money grab, that they are all about the profits, they're all about putting more money in their wallets, which, they're a business. Of course that's what they're about. What I don't understand is how this specifically does that right now. I see how it does it in the future, because they're setting themselves up to essentially be their own distribution channel, which there's a lot of money there, and even for that matter, having their own retailers, which are branded, well, not necessarily branded, but they're at least in their pocket, and they're getting kickbacks both in the production, distribution, and retail of it. Like, I can see how that is big money to be had. What I don't necessarily see is how this is that step. Aside from it just sort of this putting the ball on the tee that they're then going to crank out of the park later.
I think it's a gambit. I feel that what they are going for is exactly that. Like, their long-term idea is that we lock down the channels of distribution, we control our product as far as who's allowed to sell it at a discount where, and then once that is in place, then the average dollar sale on our products is going to increase. So we'll get more profit per unit we make. Mm-hmm. And then also alongside that, they have this idea that if a game is cheap, that's somehow bad for the brand. That part of a game costing $100 is that it already has an investment from the players, and it's more than likely to become a prestige item. They're more likely, just psychology-wise, more likely to give it a good review because they've spent $100 to get it, and then they're slowly going to build this idea that Fantasy Flight makes only the best luxury games, and you should only buy one game, and that game should be the game we make. And I think that's a little bit naive because...
Well, hang on. It's incredibly naive because let's go back in time, and Fantasy Flight did this at one point. The giant coffin boxes that were like $80 of plastic, right? They've like if they're trying to go the prestige gamut, they've already done it, and then they walked away from it.
Yeah, they walked away from it though because those big coffin box games, they were designed to impress. They've showed with a couple of the games that they could re-release those coffin box games in a little square box and it fit just fine. Mm-hmm. That was the time, and they did own that market. Fantasy Flight for a long time had fanboys because they were the only ones that made $80 board games at that point, and they were full of plastic and they were full of cardboard, and they did look giant and impressive on the shelf, and the games themselves were epic board games that took 8 hours to play. You built an event around playing one of these coffin box games. Like, it doesn't matter which one it was. Mm-hmm. They were all designed to be an epic experience, and I think that's okay. I think that is a good market to have, that we sell this big heavy game to heavy gamers. It's to me that's really no different than like the Splotter thing of selling Food Chain Magnate for $125, $150 a copy, mm-hmm. because only the heaviest gamers are going to want this. And then when they buy it, they are going to be happy with that purchase because the game just comes with that reputation of this is going to be super tight, super heavy, just hardcore gamer, all the things that make something kind of a prestige thing. So I think in the old days, Fantasy Flight kind of did that right because there weren't a lot of other $100 board games, right? The average price of a board game was $50, and you probably paid $40 for it if you bought it online. Where the problem is right now with what Asmodée is doing is locking down these distribution channels is going to cause a big problem because of what we talked about earlier about the nature of board games. Being that I don't think they are ever really going to be mass market products. You know, I just don't feel that there's ever going to be a time where you can print 10,000 copies of a game and know pretty sure you're going to blow through them in no time. I think it's always been risky to make a big print run of games, and I think it will continue to be risky. Maybe it's getting riskier since the market is fragmenting so much, right?
Yeah.
There's so many games coming out right now. It's incredible. Where I think this is going to backfire is that on paper, everything you said looks great, right? It's all upside. And when you look at a piece of paper and everything's upside, that's what happens when people who don't know how the industry works and are just investors, that's how they look at things, right? So, you know, it looks like on paper, this is going to do nothing but make huge profits. But what I think the blowback is going to be is that, you know, every game they make, they're going to have to push out 10,000 copies to make it printable. But then they're going to have a couple games that don't sell. Because there always are a couple games that don't hit for whatever reason.
Yeah.
You know, they just don't catch on. And the problem is when a game doesn't catch on, you got to get rid of those 10,000 copies. Like, they need to be gone. And when they cut off the ability for stores to sell their product at a discount to get rid of it, that's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you're expecting these stores to buy this stuff on spec that, you know, this can, you know, it's Trump, right? This game's going to be huge. and so, you know, you better order 20 copies of it because it's going to be huge. So the game store does. They order 20 copies. And then just as randomly happens, something comes out, the stars align, something's broken, whatever. This game tanks. No one wants it. And now I'm sitting on 19 copies of this game that I can't discount.
Yeah.
and you can mark them down in your store. You know, you can throw them on the 50% off rack. But let's face it, these FLGSs don't have that kind of volume.
No.
You know, most of them.
No.
To where 19 copies, even at half price, are going to leave that store.
I mean, honestly, like, think about it. We've all been in these stores, and if something is just a brick, it stays there for virtually ever. For crying out loud, like, there was one store that I frequented a lot, and you know, they had sort of a island of misfit toys back in the back corner that they just couldn't move, and they were basically selling the stuff at cost, and they still couldn't move it because no one wanted it. So that's the problem: is that if something doesn't sell, the person who really gets hosed in this case is not even the big retailer. Because, again, they can move product around, right, amongst their stores to sort of put it in a better situation where it might actually sell. But the little folks that just have a single store, they're the ones that are hosed because every single game that they purchase has to be sold.
Yeah, it has to flip, and it has to flip fast. Because even, again, in a tiny store, too, that shelf space is the most valuable thing in your store.
Yeah.
You know, if the shelf is not moving product, you know, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
And those places, when they get stuck with 19 copies of a game they can't get rid of, they're eventually not going to want to order 19 copies of the next game. Mm-hmm. And if that doesn't put them out of business outright, it certainly doesn't help Fantasy Flight move more of their future games.
Exactly.
To me, that's where the real breakdown is. Like, it doesn't really matter what happens to Amazon, right? It doesn't really matter what happens to them. It doesn't really matter what happens to Cool Stuff Inc. Because let's face it, board games, the whole of them are luxury items. Mm-hmm. There's nothing about them that will drive their sales other than people having disposable income and enjoying them.
Yeah.
So if games become $60 cash, no discount across the board, that's kind of irrelevant. If people want them, they'll go pay $60 for it. If they don't, they won't. But the fact that they've cut off the ability to move those extra copies of the bums, because, you know, it's a different world, it's a different conversation if a board game could be produced for the price of paperback copy of Dune, right? Like if it's something they could spit out, or let's a reel like a CD, right?
Yeah.
If a board game costs what it costs to make a CD, this would be a non-conversation, because you can pop out 20 CDs or 2,000 CDs, and the resources that eats are almost nothing. Like it costs like 2 cents to print a CD. And if board games were that way, this would be a non-issue. But the problem is there's so much involved with the dies and punching those games and all the artwork, the size, the weight, the shipping. All of that stuff means it's an economy of scale. And if you can't, which is usually 10,000 games, I've seen them go 20, 50,000. But anytime you're at that scale of printing, like you can't sit on that much stock. And especially, like you said, the shipping and storage is the same thing. It's because it's so big and so heavy to keep that many games in one place. There's just nowhere for that stuff to just sit around. And that's where ultimately I think this idea of controlling the prices and controlling the distribution and controlling who sells what at what price is really, really gonna bite them in the long term.
Yeah. Well, I mean, from day one, again, the knee jerk was to go, oh, here they go, taking more money, and they're doing it under the guise of helping the local game stores. And I don't think anyone fell for the whole help the local game store thing, because this isn't the way you help them. Ultimately, having exclusive rights to sell Fantasy Flight or Asmodee products doesn't make or break a game store. What makes or breaks a game store is having a committed group of people that go there. And even pigeonholing the consumer base into having to walk into a store to buy a specific brand of product or a specific family of brands of product doesn't make a loyal base. Because you're going to go and buy onesie, twosie games every now and then. Because again, I mean, I don't know about everyone else out there, but I can't afford just to buy, a copy of everything that's in the FFG catalog annually, much less everything that's in the entire Asmodee family. So what is going to get me to spend more money at a local game store is, again, that sort of interface that you have with a retailer. It's the fact that I can walk in and be catered to for whatever the particular, thing is that I'm in. I mean, this is why the tournament scene takes place at game stores and is so lucrative for game stores, and why it's so heavily pursued by game stores. Fantasy Flight specifically, I mean, they have tournaments that they push, and if they wanted to help their game store, they should have expanded that. And for crying out loud, I mean, there's any number of ways that they could have helped promote what was going on at their specialty retailers. They could have forced people in the door without pigeonholing the entire consumer base looking for their products to go there. Again, ultimately, I think that's going to put a stress and a burden on the game store to stock products, again, like you say, on speculation. And if something flops, the person that gets hosed is the game store. So again, none of us bought it, but I think when you look at the specifics of it, I don't think the specifics for that matter are even there at this particular juncture to put the money back in the pockets of Asmodee North America. I think they're setting up a longer-term play, and it'll be interesting to see what it is. But ultimately, the crux of the question, right, is what's happening to the price of games? And everyone says they're going up, and this is just sort of, one in a long series of ways that the price is sort of getting ratcheted up on the hobby. But at the same time, is that occurring? There also is a ton of games that are coming out at that like $10, $12, and $20 price point. So it's kind of a weird discussion to even try to grapple with, to figure out what the average price of games is right now and whether it's going up or going down.
I don't think you can look at the whole category of board game and make those kind of pools from that. I can tell you that, I mean, absolutely heavy, like midweight Euros, heavier Euros, for lack of a better word, those are absolutely going up in price.
Yes, that is true.
Those are, I mean, that's, as somebody who has a large board game collection, I've been buying games for the better part of a decade. There's definitely been a change in buying habits that has come from all this. Mm-hmm. And again, this is going back to where I think that the strategy looks good on paper, but where it's going to ultimately break down when it's out in the wild, it goes back to getting rid of those 10,000 copies. When your average board game is $69.99, which is kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah.
The free shipping threshold, which is kind of, cheap gamers, that's the benchmark, right?
Mm-hmm.
Get to $100 so I can get free shipping. There was a time, and it wasn't very long ago, where that meant you were buying 3 to 4 games at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And when buying 3 to 4 games at a time, there isn't typically, and again, I'm going back, 5 years, there typically wasn't 3 or 4 games coming out a quarter that you really wanted that badly. There was 2 or 3 games in the entire year that you probably were must have games for, and it could be different games for different people. But the point was, at Gen Con and Essen, there would be 2 or 3 games that you would really, really have to have. And then the rest were filler stuff that you were taking flyers on that you're like, well, that looked kind of cool, and I have $30 left over in my cart to get free shipping, so in it goes.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the consumer that is getting pushed out of this. And I don't say that from the perspective of the consumer that this is a bad thing, that I used to buy 5 games and now I can only buy 2. That is what it is. But from the retailer standpoint, I think those customers were super important, because those were the guys that were going to buy the games that didn't quite hit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that's always the stuff that fills your cart,
right.
Is the stuff that you're on the fence about.
Yeah, they were knowledgeable. They know what the game does, but it wasn't quite enough for them to really, really want it at full price.
Yeah.
But they've heard of it, so they'll take a chance on it because they need that $30 to get over the hump. And that's the only thing that's here that they know anything about it or are willing to take a try on.
You may have just sort of unlocked a little bit, maybe not necessarily the strategy, right? I don't know how skilled in the business force Darth Asmodée really is, right? But at the same time, I think one of the benefits of this for Asmodée and Fantasy Flight is going to be that there will be a constriction, or at least there potentially could be a constriction of the purchases of those sort of filler games, right? And I'm not talking about filler in terms of on the table, I'm talking about filler in terms of the order.
Right.
And if a lot of those sort of middleweight publishers that are coming out end up going by the wayside because people aren't filling up their carts with this sort of, I'm not going to call it, fluff, but again, those sort of on the fence games, then basically what we have is we have a market where there's really only room for AAA titles. And a lot of that, it's not necessarily indie stuff, but the stuff that's sort of a cut above the indie stuff, that's what ends up sort of getting thrown by the wayside, assuming, and this is only assuming, that the average consumer starts their purchase order by picking the one big AAA that they want to get in that order, and then seeing what they can slot in around it. Yeah. And that could actually be kind of an interesting outcome to this.
But here's the thing, I don't think that's an interesting outcome.
No, I don't either. I think it's a horrible outcome.
What that outcome is the video game industry.
Yeah, exactly.
Where all we're going to get is Call of Duty over and over and over and over. Because those kind of middle ground games that are, maybe mechanically interesting or thematically interesting, but not the stuff that people are talking about, not the stuff you can hype. That stuff, they have no reason to make it anymore because it's too risky.
Exactly.
That I think that was a huge resource. People like me who just want to try things, or who want to kind of get something a little bit different, a little bit something we've never seen before. I was the guy that would grab those games, those weirdo games that would just fill my cart out, and that's not going to happen anymore.
Yeah.
The other side of that too is just in the sense that the average price of these board games, and part of this is Kickstarter, right, is base price of $100 is no longer the upper limit.
Yeah.
There's been numerous Kickstarters that are $400, $500 buy-ins, and it's blind. It's nuts. Every time one of those fires off successfully, then that just, people that are counting pennies and trying to maximize, that's going to become very lucrative.
Yeah. And
again, it comes down probably to a warehousing issue. It's better for us as a company to sell 10,000 copies of this $125 board game than it is for us to sell 50,000 copies of all these different games at various price points, because that just complicates all of our infrastructure for doing that. So the prices have crept up to the point where when the games are all $100, again, you're pushing that AAA only title, because I'm going to drop $100 and I get to buy one game, and it better count. That is, I think, like the ripple effect of that is pushing out all of these, as you said, indie, like just a notch over indie game, kind of niche titles. Those are going to vanish.
Yeah.
Other than, there's and maybe this is what will be the case, will be the rise up of the really super indie stuff. We're going to circle back around to the 70s where guys were Chia Pass games, where they're ripping out these things, putting them on a Xerox machine and stuffing them in a Ziploc bag. I mean, maybe that's where we're going to end up.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, at least for me, I mean, I think that some of us kind of love the games that came out of that era. I mean, again, like I've told you, some of my favorite games are old games that kind of got packaged and sold that way, and they were super goofy and never got any traction, but they're unbelievably novel and clever. And you actually, man, you had a great analogy when you compared it to what was going on with video games. I mean, I know a lot of people say, you can't compare video gaming and board gaming, but in this case, it seems to be lining up pretty well. Because, I mean, I don't remember how many years ago it was, but EA started buying up all the development houses. And everyone said the same thing. Oh, what's this going to mean? What's this going to mean? And it was kind of the same bloodletting that was going on when Asmodee was buying up stuff. I mean, they would buy up shops, take their properties, and gut them. It's the same type of stuff. And then simultaneous with them buying up all these, studios, they also were rolling out the most ridiculous, draconian DRM on their software that they ever could possibly pack in there and still expect people to buy it. And it was simply because they were trying to crack down on the aftermarket, right? The used market of sales, right. At least for video games. That was where the money loss was. It wasn't the online retailers. So everyone freaked out about that, and everyone was worried that there was going to be this big constriction. And ultimately, there was sort of this rough patch, where for several years there were no AAA titles that didn't come out of a studio like that didn't have, again, the ridiculous DRM. I mean, you pretty much had to buy them at retail. But they actually ended up shooting themselves in the foot because, again, they were producing the AAA titles. So they would produce just a ton of them, and you could wait 2 or 3 months and buy it at a ridiculous discount at a retailer because the retailers looked back and said, we're not moving them. Like, this is your option. You can either buy it back from us or we can cut the price. And EA had to let them cut the price. And so that's kind of what happened. Well, that went on for years. Now, the video game industry is kind of through it. And we've actually seen, we're even post the rise of the indies. The indie games sort of came up and swept over, and you had all sorts of stuff going on in Steam and, PlayStation Network and Xbox Live Arcade where we could have access to these little indie games. And now all this has gone on, and we're starting to get back into that zone where there's big AAA titles, there's little indie games, and then there's a lot of mid-range stuff that's super goofy and incredibly fun. I mean, there were 4 or 5 years for a while there where, you couldn't find those goofy little games from Japan that were just the really odd ones that kind of did interesting stuff mechanically that, again, probably had no mass market appeal. But as a gamer, you were interested in at least trying. I mean, for a while, they were just gone because no one was bringing them in. Over the past 2 years, they've actually started to filter back in, and there's a whole new market for it. I wonder if, right now, again, we're kind of at the front edge of this, which means there's going to be a couple of rocky years ahead. But I wonder if in the end, we might kind of end up circling back around and being where we are now, well, where we were, and we may just have kind of all the original options that we expected. And maybe this will all just sort of provide as a big, proving grounds for what methodologies are going to work in the business world.
I mean, I believe it's cyclical. Like, I do, and I think this is aping the video game industry exactly like you said. And I agree with all that. Right now, where video games are at is a pretty great place.
Yeah.
I ignore the AAA titles. I may buy a Madden game every 4 or 5 years. But other than that, I just ignore Ultimate Shooter 9 over and over and over again. I just don't bother. I go to PAX, and the stuff that's in the indie hall is just amazing. Just gorgeous games and games that are way outside the box, and that stuff is really awesome. So I think what you said is exactly right. I think we're going to have kind of an ice age. I don't think this is sustainable. I don't think the explosion of the hobby is sustainable, honestly. Like, this is like the comic book boom, right? Because it is essentially just a hobby. And a lot of people are now discovering it, and a lot of people are going all in on it. And what's going to happen is what happens with all these booms. It's gonna swell up. Content is going to be vomited out. And at some point, just like comic books, it's going to collapse. Mm-hmm. Everyone's going to look around and be like, this is just clutter. The thing that attracted to me when I got into it, I realized I wasn't really that interested in it. Or just a couple bad experiences with just wasted money on garbage games because, they're $100 a piece and it's garbage. Yeah. You burn a lot of people once or twice on that and they're done. They get out. And, it'll eventually collapse and retract. And the lifelong gamers will be here. Like, we're not going to quit. And the whole thing will just kind of become a niche, passionate hobby that it's not a bad thing, because what is gone now, though, is the stigma, right? Like, comic books were kids' stuff, and then we had comic book explosion in the 90s. Everybody and their brother was in the comic books. There was umpteen new studios started. All of these artists from Marvel were doing their own thing. Image Comics pops up and all that. And when that collapsed, all those people that sucked into the hobby, they all went on and found something else to do. Mm-hmm. And when it collapsed, the diehards were still there. The comic books kept going. Everything was fine. But what had been lost, actually, was the stigma of being a guy who likes comic books. Because now everybody socially remembered that time they liked comic books, and now it's not a weirdo thing. Yeah. And what's going to be lost, though, is the stigma of being basement-dwelling RPG player, right? Yeah. That's the part that's gonna go away. That's a good thing. That's upside. But I do think, like, overall opinion on all of this is that the bubble is going to burst, particularly on these $100 board game ideas, because of this attempt to cut away all of that, all the places that old stock used to vent. Yeah. all those places where that stuff could be shuffled away. So it didn't bury you. With Asmodée plugging all those holes, it will explode and collapse. Yeah. It just will. I think that's the takeaway. It will, the the collapse of the industry is coming. Doomsayer. But, it's just natural. It's cyclical.
I'm sitting here thinking about, I'm trying to remember what it was like to go through this with video games. Again, not that it's a one-for-one, but at least in terms of calibrating my response to it, I think it's good to remember what it felt like and what I went through and that kind of stuff. And I remember it clearly. Essentially what I did to sort of weather the times when you really only had AAA titles to play was I had played my backlog of goofy games that I had never gotten to in the years prior. And you know what? I'm pretty sure that all of us that have larger than average collections of board games, all of us have a shelf, maybe two, maybe a whole bookcase of games that we go, man, I really need to, I need to play that finally. And guess what? If the lean times come, we got games to play. I don't know, man. Like, we'll see. It could be interesting, but and I'm saying that again in my sort of passive, semi-aggressive way, where it's like interesting is a veiled way to say horrible. But at the same time, I don't know. I'm very curious. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah, it'll be an interesting next couple years, I think.
Mm-hmm.